How many of you have never seen The Natural? Wow. Kind of envious in a way. But we have a very special guest for The Natural. He was Oscar nominated for cinematography for this movie. He's also been Oscar nominated for The Right Stuff. Fly Away Home. The Patriot. And The Passion of the Christ. Please give a warm New Beverly welcome to Caleb Deschanel.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thanks. I was telling Brian that my youngest daughter Zoe used to come here many, many years ago and watch lots of movies when she was in high school and when she was supposed to be in college, but she was starting to work, so. And he was jealous that she couldn't come. Oh, you can't hear? Hello?
Get it closer.
Oh, is that better? Okay. Anyway, she would be here if she wasn't out of the country, so anyway.
I think it's a pretty cool place to get your film education. See lots of classic movies.
I mean, honestly, I was telling Brian that when I was in college, I started out at Johns Hopkins, and I went to work in summers in New York, and I would go to the Bleecker Street Cinema and the New Yorker and the Thalia theaters, and they would all have these old movies, and that's where I really learned about making. Actually, it was before I knew that I wanted to make movies, and it was, my education really early on before I went to film school. So, it's like, I think to be a writer, you have to like to read, and I think to be a filmmaker, you have to like to watch movies, so.
I'm always amazed by my friends who work in the business and they don't actually go to see movies in theaters anymore. It shocks me.
Shameful.
Yeah, it is. So The Natural, we're here to celebrate the 30th anniversary.
Right.
And what can you tell us about the origins of the project itself?
Well, it sort of complicated the way the book, it was owned by various people and everything, and then Robert Redford got interested, and then Barry Levinson came in. But the interesting thing for me is that the book is a really well-respected book, and I don't know has anybody ever read the book? The thing that's really remarkable about the book is that the ending is a total downer compared to the movie, and yet it has all the same elements that go into it. I mean, what's really great is that having Field of Dreams and then The Natural is that they're both basically mythical stories, and so everything sort of operates on a level that's sort of hyper real, and what was great for me was that you could create sort of visual elements that would repeat themselves, that became part of the milieu of the mythology. I mean, I don't want to ruin it for anybody, but there are definitely archetypal characters in this movie that carry through, and the book was pretty well respected, and a lot of literature scholars wrote about it and wrote about the mythology and about how there are characters based on Babe Ruth. There's characters there are incidents based on the Black Sox scandal. There's a story of a woman who pursued baseball players, which was based on a reality, and it's all woven together in a mythology. I mean, just like Star Wars or Greek mythology or anything. I mean, they're really elements of the film that really are not real, but bigger than real.
And how does that affect your approach to the photography when you have elements like that aren't necessarily real, but maybe are magic realism, or however you want to?
Yeah, I mean, we would, for instance, there's a character in the beginning of the movie who sort of tries to seduce the main character, and when she's introduced, and when you see her when she's about to seduce Redford, she's sort of silhouetted against a window, and then there's a character later on, Memo Paris, who's played by Kim Basinger, and when she's sort of seducing him, she's sort of silhouetted against a window, and and they're characters who are all in black and white, and they'll be brought out, like there'll be a red, rose or something, and so we're able to sort of use elements of of sort of visual repetition that was to remind the audience, maybe not in a conscious way, but in a subconscious way, that you're experiencing the same sort of element of the drama that's going on, and continuing on within this mythological story. So it was, I love working on projects that are like that are either historical or or have sort of mythical elements, because you can sort of elevate that reality and you can exaggerate it in ways. I mean, the end of the movie, for example, again, I don't want to ruin it for people who haven't seen it, but the whole end of the movie is, there are these fireworks that go off, but what's sort of amazing about it is that you take the audience along in a story to a point where they want something to happen and they want to believe that something will happen. And then when something that is totally ridiculous, like, well, the Field of Dreams is a perfect example. I mean, you really, as an audience, Phil Alden Robinson, who wrote and directed it, took you on a journey where you wanted this myth to be fulfilled. And when it's fulfilled, there's not an element of real reality to it, but you totally believe it because you've been taken along in this story and you've been brought into that myth, and he's explained that myth and he's drawn that myth, so well for you that you want that to happen. So, I really don't think we as human beings could really survive the reality that we have to face every day without having some kind of myth or some kind of sense of other reality in our lives to sort of make sense of all the things that happen, that all the horrors. I mean, if you read the newspaper, the things, and the myths sort of help us to sort of organize those things in a way that help us survive it and get through it. And just like in Field of Dreams, the natural takes you along in a mythological story that each increment of the story that takes you from one phase to the next takes you along to the point where finally at the end of the movie, there's this sort of incredible wish fulfillment that is really wonderful. But if you analyze it, you say, well, that could have never happened, and that's totally unreal. But you as an audience so desperately want that to be the truth that you believe it. And the odd thing about the movie is that it's based on a book where all the same stories happen, but at the end, one takes one direction, one takes another direction. And so it's sort of interesting to read the book, because I read the book and I kind of felt like the movie, which took a sort of heroic, choice at the end, and and it is very uplifting. The book is a very dark, drama at the end, even though the elements right up to the very last part of the movie are exactly the same. So it's an interesting, if you read the book and you look at the movie, it's an interesting concept to think that you can take the same elements and you can tell a story through a certain point and then alter the ending and still be very successful, with the choices that are made, even though they're so different.
And I think it comes down to craft and execution too, because if you give someone a one-paragraph description of the natural, they can make a movie that you wouldn't buy into and that you wouldn't be taken along. But I think the craft of you and Barry Levinson and the screenwriter and everything and the performances really take you on that journey, and you want to believe and you want to see it go that way.
Yeah, I mean, all the characters are sort of wonderfully drawn. I mean, they're just, they're so beautifully done, so it really makes you draw you into that story. They're just, they just, their unreality is so well presented to you that you totally believe it. I mean, just the way you believe characters in a futuristic movie like Star Wars or something like that. So it's sort of wonderfully done in that one.
So how did you come on board this movie?
Well, I got a call and to meet Barry, and we talked and we got along. We both like baseball, which helps. And Barry is from Baltimore, and I grew up in Pennsylvania, but I went to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and I went to a prep school near Annapolis. And the two of us together, if we start, spend time together, we start talking with this terrible Baltimore-ese accent. And so I think that may have been part of the element of it too, that we just sort of got along. And then it turns out that Roger Town, who wrote the script, also is, became a good friend of mine, and we, our kids went to school together and all this stuff, but we became friends on the film as well. And he also has a great interest in baseball. So I mean, it really goes back to baseball. And there's something about baseball. When you go to a baseball game, the game's important, but there's something about the spirit of what goes on around the quiet moments in between things happening in baseball. And I think there's something about this film that draws upon those elements, those quiet moments in between when decisions are made, and should you replace the pitcher, should you hold out, and is he going to throw that ball, and the guy's going to hit a home run, or when how you make those decisions. I mean, it's a very complicated game. And a lot of, we tend to, if we grow up in America, we tend to think of baseball as simple, but it's not. And I mean, I know that for sure because my father grew up in France, and I have cousins in France, and one of my cousins' kids would come and visit us, and my kids would visit them. And one of our, my cousin's son was visiting, and I took him to a baseball game, and I was trying to describe what goes on in a baseball game, and it's really complex. So you have to throw the ball, and it has to be, over the plate, between the knees and the shoulder, and that's a strike. But if it's outside that, it's a ball. But if the batter swings and misses, no matter where the ball is, it's a strike. And it goes on and on. We just happened to be sitting behind two guys who were working for the Giants, because it was the Dodgers playing the Giants. And after about 10 minutes of me describing all the rules, if it catches the ball before it hits the ground, it's an out, but if it hits the ground and he catches the ball, he has to throw it to first base before the guy gets there. Or if there's a guy on base and he's running to second, if you get it to second base before running to third, and I'm going on, and these guys turn around and say, "Oh my God, we've been in baseball all our lives and we had no idea it was so complicated." So there is an element. I mean, I don't know how well the film did overseas or not, but baseball is a sort of mythological sport in the United States, and I think because our whole culture and our whole history is tied to baseball in so many ways.
And I think if you grow up on it, it's in your DNA. So, whether you're a casual fan or not, you know all those rules, even though you don't realize how complicated it is.
It's true. I mean, you just kind of accept it. I mean, we lived in England for a year, and I had a friend take me to a cricket game, and, to this day, I mean, after hours of him explaining to me, I have no idea. And people say it's like baseball, but I don't get it. And the other thing I don't understand is how those games can go on for 2 days. At least we have 9 innings.
Now, prior to this movie, Barry Levinson had made Diner, and that movie is really more known for its characters and its dialogue. And he would become much more known for visuals as a director as his career went on. So when you're doing his second film with him, how do the two of you collaborate on the photography?
Well, I mean, I tend to get hired by directors, and then they kind of, sort of give me, some free rein, and then we would talk about things. But, generally, after talking with Barry, I sort of had a really clear idea of what he wanted, and then, I kind of knew what I was looking for. And, most of the time, we just were pretty much in sync with the way things were going. I mean, we knew that there were certain, times of day and certain, elements of the sunlight and the dark and shadow and that kind of sort of thing. I mean, the sort of great moment when, Bob Duvall comes back. There's a scene. There's early on, Redford, is on a train, and Bob Duvall's there, playing this character as a news writer and everything, and then they sort of lose track of Roy Hobbs, the Redford character for years, and then, later Bob Duvall starts imagining it, and there's a great moment when they come together again, and it's in a rainstorm, and it's like, it's so obvious that we're using elements of the environment to sort of help tell the story, but it's really great and it's really dramatic. We actually had an incredible storm in Buffalo where we filmed this, and we actually set up a camera, looking out on the field, and just let it roll for 1,000 feet, and must have had 100 lightning strikes in the thing, and a lot of those shots are in the movie, so it was pretty amazing. We obviously created rain ourselves in this scene, but it was really a wonderful, it's wonderful to use, the environment as a way of helping to tell the story, and it was used a lot in this movie. The other thing that Barry came up with, which I had never done before, but there were times, the Barbara Hershey plays this slightly evil character, and there are elements when she suddenly is sort of shifting her attention from one character to another, and we ended up shooting those shots at 48 frames a second, so you actually see her sort of blink and sort of look like this, and it's not enough to really give away that it's slow motion or anything, but it makes you sort of hyper sensitive to things, and we used that a number of times. It was similar to, I don't know if you've ever seen Jules and Jim, but Truffaut would do that with Jean Moreau, is that he would do these sort of like frozen frames, of moments, of little fade. And it was kind of in that kind of genre of just, helping the audience just be hyper aware of something that was going on from a dramatic point of view, and a shift in the character's emotion. And I thought that was a really great idea of Barry's, to do that.
And what about from a preparation perspective and blocking scenes? Did you work from shot list, storyboards? Did you just work out the blocking each morning? And
we didn't have any storyboards. We would just, we'd know what we were going to do during the day, and then we'd sort of stage it, and then I would try to, adjust where we were shooting in the field so that we could get the kind of sunlight that we were looking for, and we would sort of use elements of the sun coming through parts of the stadium and everything, and then move things and stage them there to sort of get that. At the end of the movie, there's a scene where Redford's throwing a baseball, and it's in a field, and it was at the end of the day, and the sun was setting, and we would go and set up and get a shot, and and Bob would throw a ball, and then suddenly the sun would disappear because it's going over a hill, and we see there's sun over there, and we go, Bob, run on over there, and we grab the camera and go running after him, and then, okay, throw the ball, and okay, good, oh, it disappeared, and then, we kept chasing the sun for, we would just, find these things as we would go along, but, I think mostly, a lot of the prep came in finding locations, and we were that would really suit that period of time. And we shot in Buffalo because we found a stadium. But the other great advantage of Buffalo at the time was that Bethlehem Steel had closed like a number of years before, and it was a city that was really, kind of suffering. But the greatness of cities that suffer is they don't destroy their heritage. The great old Louis Sullivan buildings and Frank Lloyd Wright buildings and everything. All those buildings exist there, and there were some really beautiful old buildings that we used in downtown Buffalo. And had it been a very successful city, they probably would have said, tear down that building and let's put in a glass and steel structure and all this stuff. So sometimes preservation is a product of of failure, and sometimes it's a product of people who really care for things that should be preserved.
Can you talk about photographing the baseball scenes, and did you shoot multiple cameras, or what were the challenges of?
We didn't actually shoot a lot of multiple cameras. It was pretty well laid out as to what happened, particularly in the last sequence. About who gets on base and who strikes out and what happens, and all these things, but there were times when we were actually staging full scenes, or actions in the movie, like a steal to second, or a guy running around a third or something. Because Wilford Brimley, Barry was very frustrated because Wilford, he would say, okay, well the guy's running to second and then he's running to third and then he slides and he's out, and Wilford go, well, I have to see it. So they would actually stage all these things when we were on a close-up of Wilford Brimley just to get the action. But you also have to understand that Wilford became an actor later in his life and had spent a number of years as a bodyguard for Howard Hughes. So he was not really an actor. So, but he's great in the movie. I mean, he's really, really fantastic.
He's a wonderful actor.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Way in the back row. You, sir, yeah.
The score by Randy Newman, right? Yes. Okay.
The score's by Randy Newman.
Yeah, I wanted
Yeah.
to know, because the score plays such a powerful role in the film, I know that usually it's done in post, but were you aware of the score at all when you were shooting? Because they seem so synchronized and they're just so harmonious, and so I was wondering about that.
No, I mean, that's the amazing thing about music, though, is that, the composer comes in and, puts it together. I mean, usually you end up using temporary music when they're editing the movie, and they somehow, get a rhythm with that, and then sometimes that's transferred. But I mean, I think it's one of the great scores. It's really an amazing score, and it's been they've used it a number of times, during World Series when things have happened in the World Series that are similar things that have happened, from the story of the natural. So it's great to hear that score every once in a while. But Randy's amazing.
Yeah, it's a great score. Another question in the middle there. You, sir, yeah.
Caleb, would you talk about two things, the baseball, when they get off the train, the sunset baseball game, was that shot in one afternoon? And the Glenn Close when, with a hat in the...
Oh, yeah. It's funny, I saw Glenn about, a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about the hat too. But, yeah, the baseball game when the Whammer pitches to Redford and when Redford pitches to the Whammer and he strikes him out, it was shot over 2 days, the main part of it, and then there's shots of Redford when he's pitching that were shot with a really slow motion camera, which is 360 frames a second. And we shot those on a day off, which was a Sunday, when we just went down there with just Redford and I think Bob Duvall was there, and but yeah, just because it was so difficult, we had to get the right light and everything for those pitching shots. You'll see, if you haven't seen the movie, it's early on in the movie when the train stops and they go to this carnival, and then they go out and have this. Basically, it's a duel between Redford as a pitcher and the Whammer, who is supposedly Babe Ruth. I mean, it's based on Babe Ruth anyway. So, and then the Glenn Close, the hat was actually sort of a donut. It actually didn't have a hat, and it was made out of a a sort of gauzy material. And what I did in order to get the light on it is that we had we used arc lights in those days, and there was a small arc light, which was a 175 amp light, which is like smaller than your normal big arcs that you use. So we had it up at the top of the stadium. And what I did is that I arranged extras in front of it. And then the ADs would call, had the extras arranged in an order of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what they would do is they would start, they'd go out, and as they went out, a little light would hit the hat, and then another one would go out, and more light would hit the hat, until finally all of them left, and Glenn Close stands up, and she's in full light. And everybody else is in shadow, because it was, the only light that was really coming in was just sort of skylight, and then the arc light that was hitting the back of her head. So that's kind of how we did that sequence. And again, I mean, it's another sort of mythological kind of visual image that, you know, probably could never exist in reality, and yet, you know, as an audience, you just get behind it because it's the one thing that draws Redford to, you know, to her and makes him aware that she's in the audience.
I heard her story that you actually had a hole cut in the filter. Is that?
Oh, yeah,
is
that's
that-
true too.
that's
So
true,
I had Pancro, which makes filters. I had a number of shapes of filters that would be dark around, and then there'd be like a crescent shape, and there was a circle shape, and I would use those on occasion when we wanted something really bright. And in this case, I had that, but you know, that was probably like 15% of it, and the rest was with the arc light that we had up there.
Do you have any stories about working with Robert Redford?
Yeah, he's always late. and we used to, the production used to say, okay, Bob, your call is 10 o'clock. And that was because they really needed him at noon. And somehow you'd always get wind of it and show up at 2 o'clock. So I don't know what it was. I mean, you know, I've heard stories about him even directing movies, and I don't know what it is, but it's sort of this pathological thing with him. But it ended up working to our advantage for all the sunset shots we got with him. we never got to shoot with him in the middle of the day because he was always late. So, but he's great. I mean, I know him pretty well because I go every year that I'm available. I go up to Sundance and am an advisor up there, so I always see him up there. You know, we've gotten to know each other a little bit better, but I don't know whether that will ever change about him showing up on time.
Now, this movie has an amazing supporting cast of character actors, you know,
Yeah.
with Robert Duvall and Wilford Brimley and Richard Farnsworth and Darren McGavin and Robert Prosky. Any stories about working with any of them?
Well, they were all great, really professional people. I mean, I've worked with Bob Duvall a number of times since then, and we were actually getting ready to film in a sequence, which we shot actually on the Queen Mary in a big ballroom there, and we just sort of started talking. It turned out we had both gone to the same prep school near Annapolis, Maryland, you know, years apart. And then since then, I've run into people who were in his class who told me that he'd been kicked out of school. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, he, you know, put a firecracker in a teacher's desk, and you know, it was like the end of the school year. And I ran into Bob afterwards, and I said, Bob, I hear you were kicked out. I wasn't kicked out of school. He says, they don't know what they're doing. So then I go back to the guy who told the story, and he says, well, yeah, it was the last day of school, and I think they told him not to come back the next year. So I guess technically he wasn't kicked out of school. But he's a great actor to work with. I mean, he's, you know, he just finds these wonderful elements to sort of, you know, create, you know, reality of the characters. And I mean, all the actors were just, you know, Richard Farnsworth was really wonderful. I mean, you know, Wilford Brimley, of course. And yeah, I mean, they were just, I don't know, I mean, it's just a great collection of people. I mean, it was one of the earlier films that I did, so I didn't have any idea that I shouldn't have been, you know, that I should have been much more impressed that the cast was there. And since then, I can think back on it and think, oh my God, you know, I'm actually working on a movie now where there are a lot of, you know, people like that who are just coming in for a day just because, you know, they like the director. But it's really nice to, you know, to see these people work, because almost every one of the great actors that you work with, no matter how small the part, you just feel they bring something to it. You know, they come with an approach to it that just elevates it above what you read on the page. I mean, I'm always reading a script, and when I finish reading the script, you know, there'll always be scenes that I'll go, I don't know how that can work. I mean, I get the idea of the scene, but I don't know how it can work. And then a wonderful actor will come in, and he'll do something that just, you know, shocks you and goes, oh my God, that's the way it works. I mean, I remember A Message in a Bottle. I was working with Paul Newman, and there was a simple scene in a coffee shop where he's waiting for his son. You know, it was Kevin Costner, And he was sitting in one seat, and the guy there, and the idea was that he normally sat in one seat, and he was sitting in a different seat in this place that he comes to every day. And it was sort of indicative of the fact that he was sort of off sorts because he was worried about something. And Paul Newman, like when the guy said, "Oh, what are you doing sitting there?" He just threw the stuff down, got up, and stormed over to another place and sat down at his regular table. And you go, "Oh my God!" And it was so shocking because you didn't expect it to happen, and yet it added such a wonderful element to to that particular performance. It's just great, when you see somebody find something that just makes it, just elevates it above what you expect it to be.
Is there anything you want to say about what you're currently filming?
Well, I'm doing a film with Warren Beatty, who hasn't done a movie in quite a while, and he's written it, he's producing it, he's directing it, and he's starring in it. So it's a clash of four ideas all at once, and it's actually a really wonderful story. I mean, it's kind of about Howard Hughes, but it's and Warren plays Howard Hughes, but it's really about the people who work for Howard Hughes. So the story is not really centered on him so much as it is his influence on them and the kind of, the sort of ideals that are imposed on these people who work for him.
Now, you got your first Oscar nomination for The Right Stuff. Did that happen during the filming of The Natural, or was the timing something like that?
No, it was before that. I mean, that I heard about it? Yeah, I heard about it before.
And what's it like being nominated for Academy Award?
It's great. No, it's really fun. I mean, obviously the first time is like really exciting. Because you don't really, you obviously don't expect it. I don't know. You just you feel honored to be, because when you're nominated by your peers who are cinematographers. So it's people who you respect, and lots of times they're people who are your mentors and everything. I've been nominated 5 times, and it's really a wonderful honor and everything. But just recently, Gordy Willis died, who was my mentor, and Gordy was only nominated twice for 2 sort of relatively insignificant films, which was Zelig and Godfather 3. And yet, the great films that he should have been nominated for, which was The Godfather 1, Godfather 2, Annie Hall, Manhattan, All the President's Men, I mean, I could go on and on. He didn't get nominated for, but, we were talking earlier that Phil Alden Robinson and I were, on the board of governors of the Academy, and Phil was one of the people who really pushed for Gordy to get. So it's only appropriate tonight that 2 of us should be here, but for Gordy to get an honorary Academy Award. But when he passed away, last week, they all refer to it as an honorary Academy Award, but it's not like an honorary degree where you get you've been successful and you went to our college and we give you an honorary degree. No, this is, it's a real Academy Award, and I think everybody in the Academy felt that, and I sort of resent the fact that when they report it, they say it's honorary, because, he deserved that for so much great work.
Yeah, you've certainly done the work.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and he was my mentor. I studied with Gordy, early on before he had done the Godfather films. A friend of mine, Matthew Robinson, had an internship on a film called Loving, which he shot, and with Irvin Kershner, who directed it. And I had seen a couple of things, and I thought he was really great. And the AFI, where I was going, who was sort of arranging an internship, wanted me to study with an old-time Hollywood cameraman. And I said, no, Gordy's shooting the things in the way that I really like. And so that's how I ended up with Gordy. So a lot of what especially in my earlier films, a lot of the way I did things, I really learned from Gordon.
Another question from the audience? Yes, sir.
Yes, with the advent of digital technology, are you optimistic about the future of the aesthetic and storytelling?
Well, it changes so fast. It's sort of hard to get your head around it. And I've shot I'm shooting a film digitally right now, and then I shot Jack Reacher with film, and then I shot, Killer Joe I shot digitally, which is the first film I shot digitally. I mean, there are advantages to it. I mean, I still love film, but, Deluxe just stopped processing film on May 9th. And so there's one lab in LA and one lab in New York, and, unless we start to go and create our own labs, I don't know how much longer they're gonna start, making film. It's gonna be, the biggest problem I have with digital is that every frame is exactly the same. Because, what records it is these little pixels that are exactly in the same place. The great thing about film is that every frame is different because they pour this emotion, on, this backing, and each thing is different. So it's like this, and what that does is that it's more forgiving to the, to all the, the scars and the problems with people's faces and the pock marks and everything. It's much more forgiving, and it's really wonderful. And if you think about it, Kodak and Fuji and the film manufacturers created film to represent the human skin. I mean, that was one of the things that was really important, because it didn't matter if a person's jacket was slightly off color, when you saw it, nobody's going to remember that. But skin tone, you really notice, and that's one thing that was great about, film. And I feel very nostalgic about film. I mean, when Kodak went bankrupt, and when they stopped processing film at Technicolor, and then they stopped processing at Deluxe. It was sad. It was kind of like losing a friend. So, I think eventually the digital technology is going to get to a point. It's getting to a point where you really have no choice. When I was doing, I did this film Winter's Tale last year, and I remember going to the producer saying, well, we have to decide if we're shooting, film or digital. He says, let me show you something. And it was a budget from Warner Brothers, and there was nothing in the budget for film and processing. And this is like a year and a half ago, something like that. So, it's more being forced, not by, cinematographers, I think, would probably shoot more film if they had the choice, but they're being forced by all sorts of, giant brains who make decisions that aren't necessarily good decisions. The consequence of that, because they force those decisions, is that you can no longer have deluxe processing film because there's not enough film being processed. So it's only people with a lot of power, like Christopher Nolan and Quentin Tarantino and people like that, who can force the issue. But your average director who's struggling, who's just excited to get a movie made, doesn't have the power to say, we're shooting film. It's like occasionally you get people sort of fighting for it, but it just gets more and more difficult. In the end, we're just recording, light and shadow and everything, and
How do we make the image matter again?
What's that?
How do we make the image matter again?
Well, I think it always does matter, and it's, it's like every development of any technology. You look at something like Gravity, which is literally, it's basically an animated film, but it's beautifully done. You can put artistry into anything, and it's, they're artists who create videos. It's just going to take, a genius, filmmaker to go and finally settle on the fact that, okay, digital has finally arrived. Right now it's sort of a hodgepodge of everything, and even films that are being filmed on film, they're using lots of digital cameras to capture other things, and parts of it for visual effects or for all sorts of things. So, right now we're in an era, even if you're shooting on film, you're still shooting a melange of lots of other things. So.
Another question from the audience? You, sir, in the back?
Yes, I was wondering how closely is either the novel or the film based on the real life story of Eddie Wakus of the Phillies?
The real life story of,
Eddie Wakis of the Phillies, how much is based on his,
I have
you have no idea?
idea.
Okay.
That's a question for the author.
Another question? You, sir?
With the common projection format now being 2K, do you think we've lost something from 35 projection?
Plus something what?
Do you think we've lost quality going from 35 millimeter projections to 2K projections pretty much?
Oh, definitely to 2D. Listen, I did a film with Billy Friedkin, a couple of films with Billy Friedkin, and he loves digital. I mean, he loves the fact that he doesn't have to go see a scratch print and see things faded. And I mean, I was talking earlier about the fact that it's the 30th anniversary of The Right Stuff, and they were having a big screening in Washington, and Phil Kaufman asked me to go to Warner Brothers and look at the print. And the print, was okay for about the first 2/3 of the reel, and then suddenly it was like 2 stops dark, and obviously nobody had ever checked the print. This is at Warner Brothers, and this is a print they were going to send, and we finally had to really fight them to get a good print. So, they're moving towards 4K. Other people say 8K, but to me, it's not the quality. It's not technically how much detail is in the image, because there's plenty of detail in digital. It's just that every frame is the same. Every frame is a clone, like I was saying, and that's the part that bothers me. Is that you don't have that sort of wonderful dancing, emulsion that creates the magic in movies.
No, before we wrap up, I want to ask you one question about The Right Stuff. Last summer, we celebrated the 30th anniversary here, and I did a Q&A with Jeffrey Kirkland.
Oh.
And Jeffrey was a production designer. He was Oscar nominated for his work on that film as well. And he told a story that some of the special effects aerial shots came in. And he said you and he and I assume Philip Kaufman and a handful of people went to see a screening of the work they had done. And Jeffrey said it was, the aerial shots, he said they were just perfectly done. They looked like something out of Star Wars. They were flawless.
All motion control.
Right, but he said the two of you came out, looked at each other, and were kind of speechless, and you were both kind of like, what do you think? And can you talk about what those shots were replaced with ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, there was a film called Firefox or something that they did all this, in 2001 it's all this motion control. It was beautifully done, but it's like outer space and it's pristine and everything's moving perfectly. And and Phil Kaufman always said when we started the film that he would like to pass out vomit bags at the screening so that people would really get an idea of what it's like to fly, at supersonic speeds and come into the atmosphere and all this stuff. And the Gary Gutierrez, who did all the visual effects, started out doing it with motion control, and all the planes are flying perfectly. It was so boring. So we went out and we started having them throw these model airplanes off of buildings and start shaking the camera. And whenever we would film, the sequences in the, in the airplanes, we would always get that kind of vibration, that you would get. And if you look at it, I mean, things are shaking all the time. And there were a couple of times when we were filming in the capsule that, my operator was operating it, and I would just whack the camera like this. And there was one time when I actually gave him a black eye because the camera moves so much. But if you see the movie, it just has an immediacy to it. And it was really important to the movie that you have that feeling. And I remember at one point I was, we were trying to get plates for backgrounds for actually some of the rockets, and I went up in an old fighter jet with a test pilot for Lockheed. And I was in the back seat with a camera and I was filming. And we were diving and pulling G's and everything, and we got some really cool stuff. And we took off out of Van Nuys. And we're going and I'm trying to get clouds because it's the only way you get feeling. And say, oh, those clouds over there. We go, you fly by those. Okay, that was great. Okay, yeah. And then I reload and there were clouds. And finally, we get some. He's saying, well, listen, I'm not sure where we are. He says, oh, gee, I think we're over New Mexico now. Whoa, I mean, it was like amazing how fast you. And we come back, and we land, And we get the film processed, and I go into the movie theater into the theater to watch projection of it the next day. And you have to understand, I mean, I grew up sailing sailboats and all this stuff. I've never, only once gotten seasick. And all of a sudden they start projecting this stuff where I was there in the plane when it was going on, and both Phil and I literally had to run out of the theater and couldn't watch it because we almost got sick watching it. And when I was there, for some reason, you feel the physical, you feel what's going on, and it didn't make me sick, but I literally couldn't, watch it without, feeling sick. But yeah, it was. Phil really wanted everybody to have the experience of being, one of these test pilots, and I think he did a really effective job. It's funny, I mean, I have to bring this up just because, if you look at Gravity, they have those reflections in the helmets and everything. Well, it's all created digitally and everything. And I was just thinking about, on the right stuff, I had, this horrible problem of these helmets that had, these reflectors, they reflect everything. And you brought the people onto the stage, and you could see the stage lights overhead, and I had to rack my brain as to how to cover that up. And so I remember from like theatrical, productions where you would have a scrim, up on a theater. And if you light it from the front, you can't see through it. And you'll see the light go off in the front, and the light goes up in the theater behind, and suddenly there's a living room set, and then the scrim goes up, and I thought, wow, if we had a scrim of blue over the thing, and then light it from below so it's all lit, then you just reflect this blue, and you can't see the structure of the scaffolding overhead on the stage. And I had a crane with the sun on it, so we'd have that. And that was the only thing you see through the blue, because it was coming through the scrim. And then we just use liquid nitrogen going through, and everything was reflected in there, and it was great. And I was thinking, boy, if we had had the technology they have now, we could have saved ourselves all that trouble.
Well, Caleb, I want to thank you so much for coming and being with us today. Enjoy the natural.